Okay, I know there's like 9 people here, but I'm going to use this so the camera can hear me. So my name is Rachel Thomas, and I know you were expecting Ian McDonough tonight. He could not make it this month. Unless you saw the Facebook event, then you're expecting me. Tonight I'm excited to share with you some of the research I did many years ago from a series of letters I found at the University of Puget Sound archives. So I'm going to tell you the story of these letters. The letters are from the Methodist Mission organization, which was in New York City, from missionaries that lived in this area in the 1830s. So those letters were sent back to New York City, and they were stored in the Methodist archives there. Well, they eventually went and microfilmed them, as libraries tend to do, and then threw the original letters away. Who needs those? Now we have them on microfilm. Luckily, an alumni of the University of Puget Sound, my alma mater, found them in a dumpster in New York City, pulled them out, and sent them back to his alma mater. So they now are at the University of Puget Sound, which was founded by Methodists, that's why they have them there. So they have this beautiful collection of the Oregon Mission letters. And so Willamette University has most of them because these missionaries founded Willamette, but Puget Sound has a very large chunk. So when I was a student there, my very first archives job, I opened a box and went, "What's this?" I got really excited and started researching these letters. So this was kind of my introduction to primary sources and historical letters and what you can learn from them. I did a massive transcription and digitization project with them. I wrote probably 8 massive papers on it, not just college papers, but I did summer research grants, and I went to Washington, D.C. and presented it on the Hill to a bunch of senators. It was a really amazing chance to be able to share this research. But now I haven't shared it in about 10 years, so it's been a while since I was an undergrad. But I'm really excited to bring it back. It's a fascinating thing. So I'm going to be somewhat reading tonight, a little bit different than my usual speaking style, but since this is a big academic passion of mine, I'm actually using one of my papers on this because I'd like you to hear it. So the Oregon Mission of the Methodist Episcopal Church was one of the biggest and least successful missions of its time. It began in 1834 when Reverends Jason and Daniel Lee and schoolteacher Cyrus Shepard arrived in the Oregon Territory to begin a mission to the Flathead Indians. That's what they called them. This is some of the letters I worked with, so I learned how to read this quite well.
Wow.
The men quickly built a mission house, began Christian church services, and began learning the indigenous languages. They began to build outbuildings and furniture, cultivate the land through farming, and make clothing and other items necessary to their survival. Soon, it became apparent that one way the men could be effective in the area was by taking in abandoned, orphaned, and otherwise unwanted indigenous children, caring for them, giving them a Christian education, and finally converting them. Children were brought to the Oregon Mission by their tribes and families, either sent because no one wanted them or because their tribes wanted them to get an English education. The 3 men of the mission were swamped with duties. They had to provide for themselves and all of the children, continue to develop the mission properties, and build all of the necessary accoutrement for the running of the mission. They needed help, so they called for assistance. Farmers were requested to care for the lands and grow food, tradesmen to build houses, furniture, and run blacksmith operations. Teachers were called to assist in the development of schools and teaching of children, and others in the indigenous population who wanted to learn. And women were needed to sew, weave, keep house, care for the children, and even be examples of Christianity by marrying the missionaries and keeping good Christian households. The mission grew in numbers as more and more laymen, farmers, artisans, and others came to relieve the original 3 of the secular burdens of the mission. Now stop for a second. This is 3 men with 15 children in a very small house. They needed help. They really needed help. This is the ghost structures at Willamette Mission State Park out by Salem, and this shows the size of the original 3 buildings. So you've got 3 men and 15 children in these. These are not large. They're probably the size of this space over here. So it's a pretty tiny space with 15 kids. So, sound like fun to anyone? Yeah. So quickly, the mission took on the appearance of a colony with saw and grist mills, a blacksmith shop, and a school, and even a hospital. Soon it appeared that the mission was no longer a mission, but instead a settlement of immigrants from the United States. Historians continue to debate whether or not the Oregon mission of the Methodist Episcopal Church, under the guidance of Reverend Jason Lee, was a Christianizing effort, as it claimed to be, or whether it was an attempt to colonize the Oregon Territory for the United States of America. In 1834, when the missions began, the Oregon Territory was held jointly by the United States and Great Britain. Citizens of both countries lived in the area, and fur trappers from both countries held the rights to trap in its borders. The Hudson's Bay Company had a strong foothold in the territory, with forts, trapping operations, farms, and other economic enterprises. They had settlements of trappers and company employees that rivaled the population of United States settlers in the territory. The United States was in danger of losing its claim to the territory, so the arrival of the colony would have been politically beneficial to the success of the United States in gaining the Oregon Territory. When Jason Lee, Daniel Lee, and Cyrus Shepard came to the Oregon Territory, it was most obviously a missionary venture. They came to Christianize. Yet, soon, the mission had as many secular pursuits as missionary pursuits, and the number of workers had grown to alarming proportions. By 1839, the mission workers were no longer solely comprised of single males, but now included families with children and even single women. It looked like a settlement, not a missionary venture. The appearance of women at the mission is particularly troublesome to historians looking at the mission from a Christianization standpoint, as it seems to support the idea that the mission was indeed a colony. In the history of colonization, the success of any colony depended on the presence of women. The original 13 colonies in the United States were not particularly successful until they included women, as many did from their very inception. Even the colonizing ventures of the Crusades were not successful without women. Women were needed to demand civilization, give birth, bring refinement to a colony. According to Patricia Riley Dunlap, historian of women's history on the frontier, a woman's God-given purpose was to serve as guardian of all things good and beautiful: childbearing, religious teachings, education within the home, morals, and gentility. Women were keepers of civilized behavior and life, and their appearance in a colony or settlement necessitated the coming of all the refinements of civilization. When women appear in the frontier and foreign settlements, they begin to take on the look of colonies. However, the arrival of women at the Oregon Mission does not necessarily prove that the mission was a colonizing effort by the Methodists. Instead, it suggests that women were brought to the mission to assist in the fulfillment of Christianizing goals through their unique gender roles. Just as laymen were brought to farm, mill, work as blacksmiths, and engaged in other secular activities to support the missionaries, who could in turn then focus on evangelization, women came to keep house, cook, care for both native and white children, sew clothing, assist men in their duties, and teach in schools to free up the reverends to preach the gospel. The women of the mission were motivated by the same dreams of a successful Christian mission as the men of the mission. They brought their specific skills and roles unique to their gender as a support to the men of the mission. These women saw themselves as workers in the missionary enterprise, just as the men of the mission. The presence of female missionaries in the Pacific Northwest was not unique to the Methodist mission. Aren't they lovely? In 1838, a group of missionaries was sent by the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, this was a foreign mission field, keep in mind, on a mission to the indigenous peoples of Oregon, the Oregon Territory. The group included several women, including Mary Richardson Walker, who's our first woman here, and wife of Elkanah Walker, and Myra Fairbanks Ells, wife of Cushing Ells, she's in the middle there. These women show motivations for joining the mission that are very similar to the women of the Methodist mission. Mary Richardson and Myra Fairbanks were both unmarried when they developed an interest in missionary work. And we see in their diaries and letters that Mary Richardson actively sought assignment as a single woman to a post in Protestant foreign missions. From this, we can see that these women were not simply dragged into the mission field by zealous Christian husbands, but were desirous to go on their own account. They entered the mission field as married women instead of single women simply because it was a way to effect their own goals of working as missionaries. These women, similarly to the women of the Methodist mission, worked in roles to support the material needs of the missionary family. Mary had to do her cooking, baking, washing, and ironing under the most primitive conditions. In addition, she had to dip candles, make soap, milk the cows, work in the garden, burn butter, dry or pickle fruit and meat, and sew. She wasn't busy at all. Mary had to work to maintain the health and happiness of her family, as well and take on work that freed her husband up to work in the actual missionary enterprise. In fact, both husband and wife were tied up in the secular duties to provide for the wants of their family. Much of Elkanah and Mary's time and energy had been given to the necessary duties of providing for their material wants. Elkanah had to cultivate the garden and fields. Both individuals were tied up in these duties, and it took them away from their mission work. Elkanah did, however, travel quite a bit, spreading the gospel, teaching and preaching Christianity, and he did run weekly meetings and conducted religious services among the indigenous population. Because they lived in less civilized conditions, their work in the secular fields was not quite so extensive as to wipe out their time for missionary work. So they didn't build up a huge colony, so they were able to do a little more missionary work. But it was difficult living it that way. One way in which the women of the general Protestant missions were different from those of the Methodist mission was in the way they participated in the spiritual work of their mission. Walker and Els were active in teaching and preaching the gospel and assisting in religious services. While her husband was away from the mission teaching, Mary Walker communed with the Elses and with the Spokanes, the Indians they were there, the tribe they were there for, maintained the household in crude conditions and all weathers, taught English and religion, and birthed and reared her children. Walker actively taught and spread Christian religion, not only in a supporting secular role, but as a teacher of doctrine. She felt that her purpose was to be working in the spiritual matters of the mission. In fact, according to Mina Carson, through her letters and diary, we witnessed Mary Walker's almost humorous struggle with her conscience as she and her husband procrastinated learning the Spokane language, which they must do in order to work effectively as Christian evangelists. This is evidence to the fact that Mary Walker was not simply working in a supporting role in the mission. She was a missionary in her own right, and believed this was her intended role in the mission. She had to learn Spokane if she were to preach the gospel and evangelize. We see her struggle over this issue in her account of her visit to Indigenous services. She writes, "Attended Indian worship, not having done so for a long time. Fear I am criminal, not doing more. It seems a pity they have nothing more to sing. I am certainly stupid to give myself any rest till I have sufficient command of the language to enable me to translate hymns." She felt it her duty to work as an active part of Christian services. Her conscience was wrought with guilt as she considered that she had failed in her duties. This woman, who was pregnant at the time, was going to go without rest until she had done more missionary work. Besides translating songs, we know that she was busy in translations of verses. In one entry she wrote, "Spent most of the day trying to compose verses in flathead." Besides being involved in relatively feminine area of music, she was working to be involved in direct evangelization work by learning how to translate the Christian Bible into the language of the indigenous population to which they ministered. The women of this Protestant mission worked in a slightly different capacity than the women of the Methodist mission. They were actively involved in evangelism and expected to perform many of the same teaching and preaching duties as the men of their mission. However, at the same time, they worked in a support capacity, just like the women in the Methodist mission. They kept house, sewed, cared for children, taught curriculum and English style of education. These women worked alongside the men, both in the missionary enterprise and in a supporting capacity, that freed their husbands and other male missionaries to do the more strenuous evangelizing work that involved traveling long distances through harsh terrain and terrible weather, preaching, teaching, and doctoring. They are evidence that female missionary was not a foreign concept in the Oregon Territory, and that women were not mere support for the budding United States settlements and colonies, but instead powerhouses that supported and worked in missionary endeavors. Missionary women and wives were a strong presence in the Oregon Territory, however. There were other women present on the frontier at this time. Secular women lived very different lives than the missionary women. Patricia Riley Dunlap, author of Riding Astride, The Frontier in Women's History, great book, wrote of these secular women in the Oregon Territory. She said, "Many of these female pioneers who crossed the Great Plains with their husbands lived out their lifetimes in a nostalgic, silent misery, longing for the niceties and friends they'd left behind. A percentage of them learned to enjoy the experience, but almost always within the confines of acceptable womanly behavior. A third group, the thousands of female nonconformists who came to the West for opportunity offered, or in search of adventure, lived out their atypical lifetimes as outcasts from acceptable society. The majority of them were or became gamblers, prostitutes, or even man-like individuals who lived out their lives barely touched by the mainstream American society." Interesting group of women. Missionary women do not fit in any of these categories. From the evidence we have, missionary women did not live out their lifetime in nostalgic silent misery, as did the first group of secular women described in this quote. Instead, they worked hard to improve their lives and encourage the growth of the missionary effort. They were not dragged to the Oregon Territory by the dreams of unfeeling husbands, but chose to come of their own accord. Many of the women of the Methodist Mission married only to make their acceptance into the mission a reality, for they knew that single women, at least in the first years of the mission, would not have been accepted on their own. If they fit into any group of secular women, the women of the mission might fit into the group of women who learned to enjoy the experience. However, this is not quite accurate in defining the experience of the missionary women. These women did not come against their will and were eager to work hard and thrive in Oregon, as they did the will of God. Finally, these women were not female nonconformists. They adhered to the gender roles accepted for women of their time. In fact, as will be discussed later in this paper, these women were serving as examples of the acceptable Christian wife and mother to the indigenous people. If anything, they were the epitome of female conformists. The only way in which the women of the mission might be considered nonconformists was in their work. Many of the women of the mission were not simply wives and mothers, but held positions as teachers, seamstresses, caretakers for indigenous children, and other supporting roles. According to Dunlap's description of acceptable jobs for women, these positions would not have been considered abnormal. Dunlap explains that if she had a reasonably good education, a woman might be able to get a job as a school teacher or governess. If she wasn't well educated, she could become a seamstress, a laundress, or a hotel maid, or could work as a household servant. The only jobs that were thought appropriate for a woman were those related in some way to homemaking or childbearing. The work of these missionary women fit right into what would have been considered acceptable work for women. These missionary women were working in positions that fit well within the bounds of their gender roles. They were working in positions that echoed the responsibilities that they would have held if they had simply been wives and mothers. They were not, like many of their secular women, miserable victims in their lives in the Oregon Territory, nor were they gender nonconformists. These women were eager and happy to be living and working in the Oregon Territory and did not come in an effort to escape restrictions enforced upon them by their own bodies and the cultural precepts of the day, as Dunlap claims many of the secular women in the territory were attempting to do. The presence of women on the frontier, while not as large as that of men, was not uncommon. Women came for many reasons: to redefine the social and economic roles of their gender, as Dunlap claims, in loyalty to husbands with dreams of a new life on the frontier, and even by their own desire to work in Christian ministry, as did the women of the Protestant Methodist missions. The women who came as a part of a mission to suggest settlement by the United States government. In fact, compared to the secular women who came with their husbands to settle, their presence was not an indication of settlement at all. The women of the Methodist mission usually came with 10-year contracts and did not have an intention of staying in the Oregon Territory forever. 10 years? I'm out of here. Simply until the work of God in the territory was finished. The secular women who came with their husbands were coming with the intention of settling permanently and beginning lives in the Oregon Territory. This is lovely Jason Lee and an artist's rendering of those same 3 ghost buildings we saw earlier. So the men of the Oregon Mission were in desperate need of women. Not only were they lonely, desirous of wives to be their companions and helpers, but they needed specific skills that women could bring to the table in order to have a successful mission. Jason Lee, Daniel Lee, and Cyrus Shepard, the first 3 men to be sent to the Oregon Mission in 1834, were in desperate straits. They were caring for a large amount of indigenous children. Some of these children were orphans, others had been abandoned, and yet more were brought just to learn more about Christianity and get English education. Just a side note, most of the missionaries who came to Oregon were coming in response to someone who came from the Midwest to the White House and asked for the white man's God to be brought out. This is the story that goes around. There's not a lot of evidence supporting that, but that's what all the missionaries say. That's why they say they came out here, to bring God at the request of local indigenous peoples. So the 3 men were trying to evangelize and care for children, lead a school, and establish all the aspects of civilization that they thought were necessary to a successful mission. This included building houses, barns, starting a farm, making clothing, and other items necessary to human comfort. Then Daniel Lee succumbed to the climate and became ill. The men were short-handed and desperately trying to make this fledgling mission succeed. So now you've got 2 men caring for 15 children. Good fun. My husband can handle our 2 most of the time. In order to free them up to preach the gospel and evangelize, they needed help. They needed individuals who would take care of the secular business of the mission so that the reverends could focus on the spiritual work. So they asked for help. They asked for teachers, doctors, farmers, blacksmiths, and other secular laborers. Letters from individuals applying to work in the mission show that the men advertised for help in the Christian Advocate and Journal, which was the newsletter of the Methodist Episcopal Church. One man writes, "Seeing in the Christian Advocate and Journal that a steward and female teacher were wanting for the Oregon mission, I made up my mind to offer my services to the Missionary Society as steward, and my wife as a female teacher for said mission." This quote states that the mission board was asking specifically for female teachers for the mission. Women were seen as necessary and valuable to the work of the mission. The steward asked for would take care of obtaining the material goods necessary to operation of the mission, commission vessels to transport goods and missionaries that come around the Horn, and handle the financial matters of the mission. These two requested persons would work as support to the spiritual goals of the mission by taking care of the secular needs the mission presented. So families and male laborers would free the missionaries from manual labor, but women were essential to free the men from womanly duties and civilizing labors. Women were asked for as teachers, homemakers, wives, caretakers. They were needed to make homes comfortable, to teach womanly arts such as sewing and weaving. The work of women was essential to the missionary goals of the mission. Now, these are historical vignettes, don't give me too many. The men of the Oregon mission showed their need for women through their ideas about missionary work and how the goals of the mission should be affected. Daniel Lee was very outspoken in his desire for reinforcements for the mission. His unique ideas about mission and work included his desire to have the whole families of missionaries come to the Oregon Territory. He saw the work of women alongside husbands as an essential to the positive outcomes of the mission. Daniel Lee also discussed missionary work in almost colonizing terms. He makes an interesting comparison between the spread of Methodism in the early United States colonies and modern mission work. Daniel Lee's vision of missionary work combined both aspects of missionary work and colonization. The mission in place started with only himself, Jason Lee, and Cyrus Shepard, 3 men devoted to the cause of spreading Christianity. However, Daniel Lee did not think this small contingent of missionaries would be successful in their venture without additional help. The following excerpt from a letter he wrote to the Methodist Mission Board explains his ideas of how a mission should be run. Methodists went forth to colonize America, and the result you see all around you, lots of Methodists. Had they come 2 by 2 and by 3 as missions go to the heathen, what had they effected? Nothing, absolutely nothing. And where is the ground for supposing that missionaries can do more? Will the world be evangelized in this way? Never. Companies of Christians must go into every land. It will not affect the work for Zion to send a few of her watchmen. She is to go up on the breadth of the earth herself. Daniel Lee was devoted to the evangelical calling. He believed that spread of gospel was one of the highest works a man could be involved with. He viewed the Christianization, indeed especially spreading of Methodism, of America as a wonderful and beneficial thing. Second, he believed that colonizing the land with Christians would bring about a better effect than sending a few missionaries, thus supposing colonization and missionary work to be effectually the same thing, with the simple difference of a Christian colony or company being more effective in spreading the gospel than a few lonely missionaries. From this, it's not surprising that Daniel Lee supported the calling of reinforcements to the mission and was continually siding with Jason Lee as he asked for more workers for the mission. Daniel Lee would be happy with Christian settlement as an outcome because he believed that Christianity would be spread to the indigenous population through these means. So, whenever they kept asking for more people, the Mission Society would say back, "Oh my goodness, don't you have enough yet? This thing is getting out of proportion." It was growing huge. They had all sorts of they basically built a town, Salem. So, as Daniel Lee's letter continues, he calls for women and families to come to the mission work. He asks if the church will not pity have her Zion to give every tribe a missionary with his wife and their compassions. It seems for a moment that he's pulling back from his grandiose schemes of spreading Christianity through companies of Christians. However, Daniel Lee saw this as being part of a practical application of those very companies once they arrived in the Oregon Territory. He's calling for families to minister to the indigenous population. He saw the influence of women, children, and indeed the very family structure as essential to the missionary call. He thought that the mission needed more people of every gender and age to amass among the natives and spread Christianity. Indeed, in his final statement of the letter, Daniel Lee called for a chartered vessel to bear a company of missionaries. Let them go into every tribe, preaching Jesus. His dream of seeing a Christian colony begin in the Oregon Territory was simply a dream of evangelization. He did not want to colonize the territory for political gain, but to gain for the kingdom of God. He saw this colony as the greatest missionary tool they could effect, and he believed that it needed women. Jason Lee also desired women for the mission as a special missionary tool. This is a fun one. Jason Lee had a plan of evangelizing through marriage. He believed that he could cause a ripple effect through marriages that would spread Christianity from missionaries to the French-Canadian fur trappers and their indigenous wives, and finally to the indigenous populations. You see that? Missionary families have an influence on other white men married to Native women, and then those Native women would spread it to the others in the area. Marriage, one of the most important institutions of Christianity, could be a tool for spreading God. He believed that if the local fur trappers saw the missionaries getting married and leading Christian lives with their families, that the trappers would be inspired to marry their wives, which they were already living as a married couple with anyways, so the missionaries wanted to act on this, whose Native American families would see them living in a Christian marriage and desire to follow suit. Jason Lee preached the importance of marriage for the first few years of the mission, to no avail. Finally, when the Great Reinforcement, a very large group of support for the mission, came out in 1839, he was prepared to show the importance of marriage by example. In a letter by Daniel Lee to the editors of the Christian Advocate and Journal, this marriage ceremony is described. Jason Lee stood up and said, "During the period I have been among you, I have labored to engage you in the practice of whatever is virtuous, and with other things have pressed upon you your obligations in regard to matrimony. And I shall now enforce the same by my example." He then stepped forward and returned, accompanied by Miss Anna Maria Pittman. This lady right here, this is who he ended up marrying. Nearly all present were most agreeably surprised at the unlooked-for movement. I, Daniel Lee, performed the marriage ceremony, which done, Brother C. Shepherd and Miss Susan Dowling were married by Reverend Jason Lee. After marrying one more couple, the beautiful hymn, "Watchmen Tell Us of the Night," was sung and followed by a prayer. So, practice what he preached. He came out single, he didn't leave single. All the men ended up getting married. And actually, Jason Lee went through 2 wives while he was out here. He kept dying on them. This marriage ceremony shows Jason Lee's commitment to the missionary cause, as well as his need for women at the Oregon Mission. Without Christian women, the idea of evangelizing through a model Christian marriage would have been impossible. Jason Lee felt that in order to have a model Christian marriage, the wife had to be the kind of woman who was devoted to God and would live as a godly woman. She had to have the feminine skills common in women in the United States. Women who applied to the mission should have the skills of housekeeping, sewing, cooking, childcare, and other skills that would enable her to manage a household in a true Christian manner. I like how the men need to be a blacksmith, a steward, a farmer. The women have to have all the skills. You notice my list whenever I talk about women? In Jason Lee's eyes, if they could have marriages such as this, which resulted in civilized Christian households, and you know, civilized means white civilized and Christianization and civilization are essentially the same thing. He needed a woman who could help him lead by example. So, in order to make this dream of evangelizing through example marriages a reality, the missionaries needed the mission to be full of marriages. To accomplish this goal, they called for single females to come to the mission. So the mission organization ends up becoming a matchmaking organization, in essence. And began requiring missionaries to be married before being accepted as missionaries. Emmeline Lee, a woman who was applying to come work in the Oregon Mission, stated that, looking over the Advocate a few weeks since, she had noticed a communication from Reverend A. Bronson earnestly requesting some single females might be sent to that section. The men were desperate for female companionship and wives. A few men wrote assuring the board that they were married in order to ensure their acceptance as missionaries to the Oregon Territory. L.W. Miller wrote, being advised by Bishop Morris in the case of marriage before leaving for the Oregon-California Mission Conference, "I wish to report the fact to you, I am now married." Another man wrote, "You stated married men were preferred. Let not this be an obstacle in my way, for there are female missionaries here, and if you advise, probably one might go, especially if you consider it advisable." These men were willing to marry simply to be accepted as missionaries to the Oregon Territory, and knew applying without a wife would greatly hinder their chances of being accepted. They knew that having a wife was important. The writer of the second letter, William Raymond, was indeed accepted to the Oregon Mission and came to the mission with a wife. While these men asked for women to come to the mission, Their requests for supplies support the idea that women were needed for labor in the mission and mission schools. The supply missed from the mission include not only items such as grindstones and smith's bellows, but the necessary equipment for weaving a woman's craft. Jason Lee, in a letter to the board, said, "I here submit to the judgment of the board a list of articles which we think will be subservient to the mission. A loom with all the accompanying apparatus for making cloth." Although many men could sew and weave, the creation of clothing was primarily a woman's task. A loom would provide the tools for making cloth, which in turn would be used for the production of clothing, curtains, bedding, and other materials for the mission. The men not only asked for women, but they asked for the tools of women's work, items deemed necessary for the success of the mission and important enough to be requested in one of the first supply requests of the mission. All right. We'll look at women's contributions. So the call for the female missionaries from the Methodist Mission to the Oregon Territory was answered with enthusiasm. Women wrote to the board offering themselves or had their local reverend write on their behalf. Men wrote offering themselves and their wives. Accepted missionaries wrote suggesting eligible young women for the mission. From these letters, we can learn the expectation of the women. We learned what they desired and expected to do, how they viewed the missionary call, and the training and skills they thought were important to the goals of the mission. The vast majority of these women expected to come to the mission as teachers. One such woman was Mary Guthrie. She had a man in her community, Elijah Hubbard, write on her behalf, offering herself as a teacher for the Oregon mission. Hubbard wrote to the board saying, "If you have not yet found a female teacher for the Oregon mission," spelled O-R-I-G-O-N, Oregon spelled every way possible in these letters, it's funny. "We wish to mention the name of a young lady in this section of the work whom we think well qualified for the place, and who feels willing to make an offering of herself entire to God and his cause. She can, we think, present satisfactory recommendations. Her name is Mary Guthrie, about 27 years of age." Age is very important, you know. As you may recall, we know that the Methodist Mission Board had written in their newsletter, the Christian Advocate and Journal, that they were in need of female teachers for the mission. As teaching was one of the few options for single women to support themselves, calling was well answered. Many of these women were unmarried and had no prospect of getting married due to age or other circumstance, and thus could not fulfill their duties as women to become good Christian wives and mothers, but they could work for God's cause in the mission field. Okay, so we gotta look back for a second here. These were your unmarriageable women. You see any reasons why? Some of those sour faces are funny. I'm sorry. I was cracking up when I was looking at these the other day. Okay. Another one of these unmarriageable women was Elizabeth Lee. Elizabeth Lee, no relation to Jason and Daniel Lee, applied to enter the mission as a teacher, writing that she fully believed God had called her to instruct. Elizabeth Lee begged the board to allow her to work in the mission field, saying, "Since I came to the conclusion to give you my name, my mind has been unwavering, and I have joyfully offered myself to aid those who are already in this glorious work. To deny me this would be to deprive me of the greatest happiness which on earth I could possibly enjoy." Elizabeth Lee was determined to be accepted into a position which would make it possible for her to further the Lord's work in the world. She saw herself as in a support role, saying she had offered herself to aid those who were already in the work. She did not intend to be in the main role, but to support the men of the mission. "Let me have the satisfaction," she begged, "of directing the poor heathen upon whose heart the light of science